Nicole Smythe Johnson is a writer and independent curator working from and living in Kingston, Jamaica. She's written for Arc magazine, Miami Rail, Flash Art, Jamaica Journal, and several other local and international publications. She is currently assistant curator on an exhibition of the work of Jamaican painter John Dunkley at the Perez Art Museum in Miami. It was a very beautiful catalogue. It's really, really great. And the inaugural Tilting Axis Fellow. Her fellowship research looks at Caribbean curatorial practice, particularly as it occurs in artist-run and other non-traditional art spaces. And just in front of everyone, I just wanted to say how much of a pleasure it was to have her in Scotland for the relatively short time that she was there. In her last week, she gave 3 public lectures in 3 different institutions, which felt very much like a bit of a marathon at the end. But they were responded to so well, and people were coming, having been at one of her lectures, coming to hear her speak again, which I think just really says something about how much her research was resonating locally. So thank you so much for coming, and over to Nicole.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with one small correction. My name is actually Nicole Smythe Johnson. Just putting that out there. So henceforth, I can be known as Smythe. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this presentation is, I always like to start with a kind of cute little first one. And I was thinking, what would I title this? What would be my cute little title? But it's not done yet. So I wasn't able to come up with a cute little title. So I'm really going to give you a picture of work that is very much in progress, some of which I have not absorbed, right? So a lot of what I'm saying is provisional, right? It's just where it's at right now, which I'm sure all of you know is a very nerve-wracking thing. I just not realize I'm actually very nervous. But okay, so this image is actually from a Fresh Milk initiative. It's a work by Cara Springer. And so when I presented this talk throughout the region, I would start with this slide and say, who needs a gallery when you have a beach, right? To introduce some of the ideas. Today, though, I'm gonna start out by telling you a little bit about my past, how I came to be thinking about the things that I'm thinking about, then about some of the thoughts that I had that kind of structured my approach to the fellowship, and then I'll tell you about the places I've been so far and how I responded to those spaces. So let's start. Okay, so I'll try to just breeze through this. My first real curatorial role was senior curator at the National Gallery of Jamaica. This is just to give you a sense. That was the first exhibition that I did, which was called Natural Histories, and it tried to link the Natural History Museum with the National Gallery of Jamaica. O'Neill and I actually worked on that exhibition together, and so we did that in 2012. And the last exhibition I did while I was at the National Gallery was called New Roots, which was more trying to pick up on some new trends in Jamaican art. I wasn't at the National Gallery very long, just under a year. I really enjoyed the work, but the National Gallery of Jamaica is a public institution. It's run by the Ministry of Culture, and I really did not enjoy being a civil servant. So I wanted to find a way to continue to do this kind of work and to continue to be able to partner with the gallery and work on projects, but not to be as directly involved. So I moved on. In 2013, I decided I was going to become an independent curator. I read about that somewhere and I was like, oh, that sounds good. So this gives you a sense, I don't know what happened to that photo there, but this gives you a sense of some of the things that I did. I don't know why they're so pixelated, sorry. So first I worked with Arc magazine, which at the time was being co-led by Holly Bino and Nadia Huggins. And it was a sort of editorial role, but at the time Arc was transitioning into doing a lot more project work. So through that, I got the opportunity to work on the new media exhibition at the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, and then also to do Caribbean Link 2 in September 2013. Both of those were really great experiences. Then Transforming Spaces, which came through a similar kind of network, I did an exhibition there at Hillside House in April 2014. And then with Deborah Anzinger, through NLS, we did an exhibition in DC called Float, where we brought together 4 artists, 3 Jamaicans and 1 Trini. The next thing that I did was, or the next major thing was the Trajectories exhibition, so that was going home. I left the National Gallery and I thought, oh boy, I've made a mess of things, everybody will be angry. And so I went around the region for a while. And then I came back home and got an offer to work on this exhibition. Trajectories, it was a law firm in Jamaica, a very prestigious law firm. The law firm was celebrating their 70th anniversary right then. Jamaica is, 54, so that gives you an idea of what kind of law firm we're talking about. But they have one of the most important collections of Jamaican art. And so they were celebrating their 70th anniversary and they wanted a way to kind of bring out their collection. They had this fantastic collection, but the only people who saw it were their clients. And they had a kind of new generation of lawyers coming in. So they approached me and asked me to work on this exhibition. And at first I wasn't terribly excited because I thought of myself as a curator that was interested in contemporary art. And this exhibition, this collection, like a lot of collections in Jamaica, stops around the early 90s. And so I was kind of like, oh, I don't want to do that. And I actually called up Deborah and I was like, Deborah, I got this offer and I should do it, but I don't want to do it. And she was like, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to work with contemporary, I want to work with emerging artists. And she said, well, make it work. So I proposed to them putting their collection in conversation with 6 emerging artists. And so we created, or I created, I guess, 5 pairs. Deborah was in that show as well. Leisha Johnson was in that show. This is an example of one of the pairs. So that's a piece by Gloria Escofre, a very important Jamaican artist and art critic. And DeAndre C. Davis, who works mostly with digital work. And so she created this piece that responded to the Gloria Escofre. It was in an office building that we converted into a gallery space. And so there were all these little weird rooms and office separators in the middle of the space. And at first I was like, I can't work like this. This is, what do you want me to do with this? And so eventually what we ended up doing was putting these pairs in the rooms. And that worked out really well. It was just a 3-day exhibition over the weekend. But that kind of got, it was important for my confidence because it was the first exhibition that I did by myself, sort of. At the National Gallery, there's a whole set of people behind you. You have the carpenters and you have other curators to respond to and all of these things. And in this space, it was like, learn to use a drill, honey, figure it out. And so the fact that I actually pulled it off, you design the catalog and you write it up and you're also working with the artists and you're getting the things transported. And so that was really significant for me. I then worked on the Jamaica Biennial in 2014. Not as a curator, but as special projects manager. And I think this was because Verily was beginning to sense that I was a little uncomfortable in that curator role. And so what I was doing was working with the special projects. You've heard a little bit about this exhibition already from O'Neill. So I won't go too much into it, but it's important to me to bring up this one because of this project, Blue Curry's Paradise.jpg, which again, O'Neill spoke a little bit about. But the thing about this project for me, that was something that I kept going back to, was, so it started out and Blue had brought this big roll of blue, right? Of this like generic horizon, right? And we get to the airport and Blue takes so long to come out and I'm so worried. I'm picking him up from the airport. And then I get a call over the intercom that I need to come inside. And I'm like, Lord, what has he done? And it's the customs officer saying, what's the situation with this stuff here, right? And trying to explain that, yes, it's an artwork, but it's going to be thrown away afterwards. So it has no value, but yes, it is sort of very valuable because, you know, Blue had to have it printed with a special ink and all this kind of thing in London, and then we had to have it sent down. And so you get in this like deep art historical conversation with the customs officer, right? And so we move from there to putting the work up on the street. And this was really nice because we go out the day, we have these volunteers from Edna Manley, we're all putting up the work, and it starts out quite normal. And people start walking by, and at first Blue was like, I can't, I work in a studio, I can't work like this, because it was constant commentary. People were coming by and saying, that glue can't work on Jamaican walls, you don't need that fancy glue, let me tell you. You know what I mean? And they had all of this, it's true. They had all of this advice for Blue. We would also return to the sites, and people would say, oh, I've been looking after it for you. So I make sure nobody don't, but I was really excited by that kind of engagement, because I've always been very excited by Blue's work. But you think of this as quite strictly conceptual art, right? The kind of art that the man on the street wouldn't identify with, right? And here was this moment where that identification was definitely happening, maybe even a little more than we wanted right then, right? But moving forward, it became something that I was really thinking about, because I was working at National Gallery. The National Gallery is in downtown Kingston. And downtown Kingston is a very sort of depressed part of the city. So we would always be having these conversations about how to get the people that were actually in our neighborhood to come inside, right? Because you would have to be attracting people from uptown, in Jamaican parlance, to come all the way down to the gallery, right? And this was an ongoing conversation. And here in this work, that conversation started happening with work that was not particularly accessible. It's not the kind of work that you normally think, oh, this is what Jamaican public's like. You know what I mean? It's not Barrington Watson. But that conversation was happening, and people really took ownership of it. And that was very exciting for me. That was the kind of curatorial work that I wanted to be doing. So I think that feeds very much into what you'll see a little bit later with what happened with the fellowship. Finally, I will not talk about this that much, just because it's a lot to talk about. But currently, this is the project that I'm working on with Diana Nawi at the Perez Art Museum in Miami. And so it's John Dunkley is a self-taught painter from Jamaica. He was working in the 1930s, mostly. And he's a very important artist within the Jamaican sort of art historical canon. He's one of these fathers of Jamaican art that we always talk about. People may have heard about the intuitive artist canon. And John Dunkley is one of these people who's cited as working pre-independence as the guy who started this all up. When we tell the story, this is how we tell it. But he's pretty unknown elsewhere. And so this project is really about, I got a question earlier from David. He was saying to me, is the exhibition happening in Jamaica? And this is one of those few cases where the exhibition has been happening in Jamaica for the last 30 years. He's been permanently exhibited at the National Gallery. And so it's sort of this opposite thing. Because I'm usually the person that's like, oh, that exhibition didn't come to the Caribbean, screw them, kind of thing. But this is an opposite case. Also thinking about these archiving questions and all of that, but I'll try to get into that in a little bit. So about the fellowship. So when I submitted my proposal, this was what it looked like, more or less. I was interested in looking into what I called alternative curatorial practice that was emerging from the Caribbean. What I meant by alternative curatorial practice, which now, after all the places I've been, doesn't feel so alternative anymore, was, in a space like the Caribbean where we don't have a whole bunch of museums and galleries and all of this, right? I would go to conferences and I would say, I'm an independent curator, and people would say to me, okay, well, what kinds of spaces have you worked with? And I would answer, honestly, but it didn't feel like I was giving a real representation of the kind of work that I do. Which, I'll talk about what that is exactly, but I wanted to look at these other things that happen besides exhibition making, and that are particularly important in a place like the Caribbean, because if it was just about making exhibitions, it would be impossible to be an independent curator in the Caribbean, right? There's just not enough space, not enough funding. And so what I decided to do was look at 4 spaces in 4 countries. And I picked the places that I wanted to look at because I was very interested in troubling our narratives, right? So even within the Caribbean, there are certain spaces that get talked about all the time, right? Jamaica is one of them, right? Cuba these kinds of places. So I wanted to look at the other spaces, right? And really challenge myself, since I'm always going abroad and talking about, how the space I work in is very different, and it's not like you're dominant, blah, 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 blah. I wanted to experiment with myself becoming dominant in a certain way, or acknowledging a certain dominance that of the position I can occupy because I'm Jamaican. So Grenada I was interested in because I knew Malika Brooks-Smith-Lowe, who had been running Groundation Grenada for some time. Grenada was also a place that was quite close to my heart because my dad was involved in a lot of sort of political activism. He's kind of an old school Marxist. And so since I was a child, I was hearing about the Grenada Revolution, but then nobody else seemed to know about it, ever. And so, people don't talk about Grenada, but I had this sense that some really, really important things happened in Grenada. How come nobody ever talks about it? And so I wanted to go to Grenada for that reason. I was interested in Barbados because I remember when I first finished my master's in 2011, I went to Barbados and I met a young man. Even when I was there the other day, I was trying to remember who it was, but who told me that, I said, I'm doing a degree in post-colonial literary and cultural studies. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. And he said, well, we're about to open our national art gallery. You should come over here and work. And I was so excited by that for months, and it never happened. And you have conversations throughout the region and realize that, the National Gallery there has been about to open for 10, 20 years. Right? And so, I was interested in what the impact of this forever deferred National Gallery was on that art space. And particularly coming from Jamaica, where the National Gallery of Jamaica, it's the oldest and largest public art institution in the English-speaking Caribbean. It's such a beloved space for me. So it's like, how you deal with that? Was my question. I was interested in Suriname largely because when I came to the last Tilting Axis, Marcel Pinas gave a presentation about the work he was doing at Tembe. And that was just really exciting for me. Also because the work he's doing is not happening in Paramaribo. It's happening in, again, this kind of alternative space, right? Because Suriname is also another place that nobody talks about. When I said I was going to Suriname, people kept saying, why aren't you going to Guyana? You know what I mean? Because things happen in Guyana. What's happening in Suriname? And also language, because language is something that I think about a lot. And then Puerto Rico. I had been to Puerto Rico briefly in September 2015 to visit with Beta Local. I'd also seen a presentation from Beta Local at last year's Tilting Axis again. I was curious about them. We made a connection. They invited me. I went there. And I felt like I needed to go back. And I think Puerto Rico is a really interesting space because it's been written out in a different way. It's not an American space, right? We know all the reasons for that. But it's also not often thought of as a Caribbean space, really, because of the special relationship with the US. And so they were curious to me for that reason. So the idea was that I would go, I would write a text on each place, and I would look for an opportunity to make a small but meaningful intervention, right? I really don't like going into places and just throwing together a show. I like to work with artists for years before we make an exhibition. And so I was thinking about what are some other things, right? And also trying to liberate curatorial practice from this exhibition model, which, exhibitions are great, but, there are other things. Okay, so these were the things that were in my mind, the things that I was reading and the things that I was thinking about. And one of the main ideas is I'd read about this idea of the counter-public. So earlier there was a lot of conversation about who we curate for, right? And one of the responses was visitors to the museum or visitors to the space, right? And I had been often working in this position where I wanted to curate precisely for the people who weren't visiting the space, right? Those other people. And that was partly because I felt like the Caribbean had an awful lot of those other people, right? And so I was thinking about Caribbean publics as largely counter-publics, is the way that I was discussing it, for a couple of reasons. Now, the museum is a lot like a colonial school. You know what I mean? Don't run, don't do this, don't do that, don't touch this, right? And it was put much better here. Visitors were taught not only curated histories, but also curated ways of seeing and behaving in the museum. And Claire went into some of this as well in her presentation, right? So thinking about the exhibitionary complex, where it came from, right? And some of the weight that it carries from that. It was about ordering people. And I feel that, to me, it seemed like people sense this in the Caribbean and are resistant to the museum space. They're resistant to going into a place where they're being told what they can do and what they cannot do, what they must think about things. And sort of ordered by how sophisticated they could be in the face of whatever. So I really wanted to look at some of these people. Yeah, I think Claire went into a lot of that, so I don't need to do too much there. Now, yes, thinking about Caribbean publics as counter-publics, and so it seems like this very Caribbean question, right? But I also felt, and this is something I was talking about a lot in Scotland, I thought that in general we needed to ask questions about these kinds of institutions, right? They suck down a lot of resources. All the air conditioning and the special lighting and all of this to serve a very small portion of the population, right? And also not taking the questions seriously from other portions of the population. So when people are like, why is art important? How articulate a response do we have to that? And I think that that's a real problem. I don't think it's enough to just overlook it. And for these reasons here, this very Caribbean issue is becoming a much broader issue. More and more of us have to get creative with less and less resources all over, in the global north too. And also have to respond to some of the questions. As you can see here, Bill Gates thinks donations to museums are morally reprehensible, right? How do we respond to that? And so I also thought that looking at the Caribbean, at some of the methodologies that were being developed there, would be something that would become more broadly applicable, right? As more and more people had to get creative about how we think about an art space or an arts institution. So this alternative curatorial practice that I was interested in, what does this practice look like? This is how I was thinking about it initially. The focus is on facilitating artistic production and the process, not the outcome, right? So I love art objects. There are many, many art objects that I love. But as a curator, what I'm really excited by is working with artists as they're creating, right? And a kind of back and forth that happens there. And also because in the Caribbean, it's really hard to make work. It's really hard for artists to continue. And so I feel like a lot of the most important interventions that I make is how to make it easier or more possible for artists to actually work, right? Because of the kind of space that I work in. And then also thinking about facilitating public's experience of art. And so that goes back to some of the things I said earlier about this counter-public idea and also the experience with Blue. And the full range of that potential. So not just going and looking at art objects, but these kinds of moments where really interesting discussions get sparked off by reflections on artworks. And then the methodologies of this practice are, one, tactical. So, what do I mean by this? I think we quite often, and this has come up, right? You know, that these conversations can turn into a long griping session. Oh, there are so many structural problems and so on and so forth. It is very hard to address a problem at that scale, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't ever do it. I just think we do it an awful lot, right? So I think balancing it with a more tactical approach where you're thinking about short-term gains. Right now, what would make a difference right now? What is something that I could do with what is available to me right here? As opposed to if only I had, which is, you know, thinking that I often got trapped in myself. Also responsive to specific contexts and locales. So for example, I was in Scotland, went to Dundee, and I met with the woman who was leading the development of the Victoria Albert Museum there. And she was talking about it mostly as bringing these shows from the Victoria Albert to Dundee. And I kept saying to her, so what would be special about VA in Dundee? And she didn't really have an answer to that. And to me, this is extremely important, right? Where is this thing happening? And what is it responding to? And is it relevant here any at all? And really challenging yourself on those things. Self-reflexive, that, the way that you're able to do the other things is to keep thinking about it after, right? You keep making mistakes, you keep following it up, you keep doing that stupid thing, and then you have to go home and think about it and feel sort of bad and then figure out a way to do it better next time, right? And I think that I sort of make this a very active part of my practice. And epistemically sensitive. What do I mean by that? Well, in Eugenie's talk, she talks about a non-complicity with art history. I also feel this quite deeply, because for me, art history has never been very kind to the Caribbean. You know what I mean? Before the 1970s, we were, ethnological, largely. We didn't make art, we made, artifacts, right? Exactly. And so I've always held this against art history. This is where it came from, and I believe it still carries that smell. So in doing this kind of work, where yes, you still do engage art history, it's necessary, right? And you still engage those vocabularies and discourses, but constantly thinking about the implications of the kind of knowing that I'm engaging in, right? The kind of knowing that I'm privileging at this moment, and trying to let that really inform the decisions I'm making. Okay, so those were some of the things that I was thinking about going in. So the first thing I did was I went to Scotland. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I've written an essay that a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into, that is up on the TA website that you can feel free to read, that kind of talks about it in greater depth. There's a photo of me with Lucy Byatt, who heads up Hospital Field, one of the partners, and then also CCA, just to give you some visuals on what it was like. But the main takeaway for me was that a lot of this project was about finding language for things that I intuitively sensed, right, in the way that I was working. But I didn't really know how to talk about them, right? So I thought if I went out and looked around at different things that people were doing and forced myself to put it into language, it would help me to develop a language for the work that I was doing. And so Christine MacDonald, who's an independent curator in Scotland, and is doing her PhD at the Glasgow School of Art now, we had a long conversation about these kinds of things. And this quote, which I know is very long to put on a slide, so I'll read it to you. I know that a lot of the contemporary literature that comes out of London's institutions and so on will argue for the curatorial as a sort of philosophical knowledge. And I'm not as interested in that version of the term. I think about the curatorial as action and thought. I think about it as being things that we might previously have called organizing or initiating or supporting. But the curatorial offers a distinctive way to place these activities within cultural discourse. So it's not a philosophy of cultural discourse. It's about placing activity within a cultural discourse rather than it just existing in the everyday. And that felt really resonant to me. That felt like what I was doing, because that's how I think about it. In my previous life, I worked in international development as a project manager. And so curating often felt to me like taking the methodologies that I developed as a project manager and applying them to this very different space, just with different kinds of ideas around it and different things that were informing my decisions as a project manager. And so this was my main takeaway. And I looked at all these different spaces that helped me to find languages in different ways. But as I say, you can read about it on the website. And then I started traveling in the Caribbean. So I'll start out by telling you about the space and what I thought about it before I went there. And then I'll give you my first impressions and how I responded. So how I was thinking about Groundation in Grenada before I got there was this really interesting art project or art initiative that was started by an artist yoga teacher, that's Malika Brooks-Smith-Lowe, and her partner Richie Maitland, who is a human rights lawyer. And so the work that they were doing was always between those two. So they were thinking about how to kind of mobilize art and creative activity in service of various social justice initiatives or causes. They do a lot of work around LGBTQ rights And also around one of their major projects, which was in partnership with ARC, was this one, Forgetting is Not an Option, which was looking at the Grenada Revolution and kind of trying to unearth narratives around that. They did an open call, invited people to submit work about the Grenada Revolution or that responded to the Grenada Revolution, and then put together an exhibition. Another project that I was really interested in was what was then the Mount Zion Library Project. It's now been changed to the Grenada Community Library. The only library in Grenada had been closed by the government. I think it was flooding. It was due to flooding, but it had been closed for years. And so Groundation felt that it was very important to have a library. And so they started this library project, which, strangely enough, was a collaboration with a revival ministry for a group doing LGBTQ rights. This is special. So that definitely caught my eye. But the interest in libraries comes from my own work. I think some of the most important work that I do is maintaining a library. I have a substantial library in my apartment. And so a lot of the work that I think is most valuable is artists calling me and being like, Nicole, I'm thinking about this. You have anything over there I can read? Anything about, and they come by. Or sometimes I look at work and I'm like, look, you should take a look at this, Deborah, for example, looking at her work, I was like, you'd really like Wilson Harris. And no, Deborah's all about the Wilson Harris. She knows more than me. So these kinds of engagements are really important. And I think about as part of the kind of core of my curatorial work. So I wanted to go and look at how they were putting all these things together. Oh God, my time is running. So I have two little videos that give you a sense of my first impressions. I won't play that other one, it's just looking at the landscape. But I will play this one, and hopefully you can understand what's being said. So we're driving around touring Grenada on my first day. And so Malika is showing me public art in Grenada. There's a lot of it. Can you hear it? No, I'll just tell you. So there's all this red, gold, and green around in Grenada, right? And Grenada looks a lot like Jamaica physically in terms of the geography and the kind of vegetation. But I would see this red, gold, and green, and I was seeing it the whole first day and thinking, boy, Rasta take over Grenada, right? And so in this video is the moment where I say to Malika, Malika says to me, oh, all the red, gold, and green, it's from the independence celebrations that were just a month before I came, because red, gold, and green are the colors of the Grenadian flag. Awkward much? I had to confess. I was like, I was really thinking about Rasta. But this is really indicative of the whole experience in Grenada, right? Coming into a space and thinking because it looks so similar, right? And realizing over and over again, being slapped in the face by the realization that you really, really do not know, right? And I think the encounter for me with the Southern Caribbean, so distinct from the Northern Caribbean, which I hadn't realized in fullness until I was in Grenada, and that really shaped a lot of the experience. So in Grenada, they have, first impressions, again, lots and lots of public art. For me, looking around, it felt like art was just everywhere. It's like, why don't we have this more in Jamaica? If Jamaica was so painted up, every little rock, every little, these like trash would be piled up and painted. And a lot of these are actually, old tires. And they would become these really interesting installations. Also, a lot of food paintings, like agricultural products. These seem like weird observations, but I didn't want to come in with a whole bunch of ideas about what I was supposed to find. I was just looking at what was there, and this is what I saw. These are often government-sponsored projects. Every independence, the government gives out paint to communities, and they just paint everything. Right? And I loved it. It was very exciting for me. And so I was immediately thinking, oh, this is such a nice place to go in. Like, Groundation should maybe try partnering and getting some of that paint. You know what I mean? And really like deploying what's already happening. And so Malika and I started having these conversations. Groundation at the time also was doing a lot of their kind of political advocacy work. They were very active in that way. While I was there, I went to this public forum about the Grenada Constitution and got really excited about constitutional, change, which I didn't think I would be. Malika actually kind of made me go. But it was actually a great experience. And these are some of the kind of leftovers from that. They were also doing quite a bit of work through the yoga studio that is attached to Groundation. And so one of their main projects, which we went in to do some documentation of, you can't do any filming or photography in the prison, so I can only show you outside. But they were doing this yoga in prisons project, which was also pretty amazing to observe. But Groundation they were a little bit like, we don't know what to do with you because we've just been saying that we need to develop our art programming. It's a lot of the programming that they had been doing had kind of run its course. And so they were thinking about where to go next. And so in going around and talking and saying, I'm in Grenada to look at art, even Grenadians were like, we don't have any art community. There's nothing going on here. But to me, I was like, but there's things going on everywhere. Why does this not count? And so that's what a lot of the conversation was around. So we eventually decided the two small but meaningful things that I did in Grenada was one, and this was taken from an NLS model actually. NLS has done some really interesting research into the artistic community in Jamaica. Just asking kind of basic questions, because when Deborah first moved back to Jamaica and was thinking about what she would do with NLS, she very sensibly thought, maybe I should check with the communities I'm supposed to be serving and see what the situation is. And so she did these online surveys that have become a really important resource, certainly for me. And so I showed those to Malika and Richie, and I was like, let's do something like this. And so we basically did versions of that survey that they've put out now on their website. The other thing that we did, and this was a response to something I saw in Scotland. In Scotland, I interviewed Arica, early out. Tiffany very helpfully introduced me to them. And the thing that I found really exciting about Arica is that they were talking about art not as art objects or projects even. They were talking about art as aesthetic registers of sociality, right? And by that, they mean they're interested in the ways people dance, listen, talk. And so they would organize these events that would bring people together quite informally and see where it would go. And projects evolved out of that. They developed a whole methodology around this. And so we had all these long conversations, and I was thinking to myself, maybe, I was already coming to Grenada planning to talk to Groundation about Arica, because Arica also does a lot of advocacy work with sex workers and this kind of thing. And so I thought that, Groundation would be interested in them. And so in the conversation, we got to thinking, maybe what we need is an aesthetic register of sociality. We need to show that this exists. There are people who are making work in Grenada, right? And get them together to become even aware of each other and get some conversations going. And so that's what we did. We called it an artist town hall lime, because Malika was thinking about having a town hall meeting. And so I said to her, well, instead of doing a talk, which is what I was planning to do, why don't we have this town hall meeting, right? And take some of Arica's ideas. So get people together to just eat and drink together and have these really informal conversations. And so to facilitate ownership of the exercise, we asked people we provided drinks, but we didn't tell them we would be. We asked people to bring drinks and food. And we did it in a gallery space that nobody except tourists ever went into. The gallerist, Meg Conlon, was a little bit, what's going on here? This is very weird. But it actually went really, really well. So I gave a little presentation and kind of talked about what my observations were and some ideas that I would think about executing if I was going to be in Grenada longer. And then invited people to respond to those things that I'd said and to also talk about their own space and what they thought was valuable for that. And so this is a little bit of what it looked like. But as you can see, it was kind of a little party almost. But But these really, really interesting ideas came out of it that Groundation has been using to develop new programming. They've also continued with these meetings because, I mean, people were coming to tears in the conversations because they felt so isolated before that. And this like simple gesture of bringing them together to talk about the Grenadian art space as if it's a real art space. You don't have to migrate to go and live somewhere else to be an artist. Was really important for them. So that was Grenada. Then Barbados. And in Barbados, I was really interested in fresh milk. Again, because of a kind of library project with the Colleen Lewis Reading Room, but also because of their public art initiatives. So here we have fresh boards, right? And fresh stops. And so in this case, it was commissions from artists that would be put up on these boards around the place, outside. And in this one, it was collaborations with artists to design bus stops. And I thought that this was really interesting because, again, like taking art out of this, this gallery space that I'm not sure is relevant for our context. So I went. And the first thing that smashed me in my face when I got to Barbados was this thing. There was this incident. Bathsheba is a part on the coast in Barbados that's this very sort of iconic place. You can see from this photo here from a book from 1930s I just found in a collector's house. And because of the conversations that were going on. So this Canadian artist, right? Canadian, I think, yeah. Came and she did this mural on the side of it. It says, live a life worth dreaming. So over the weekend, my first weekend, we went on an island tour and we stopped at Bathsheba. And we were there taking our selfies, you know what I mean? What a sweet little message, all this kind of thing. Put them on my Instagram, all of this. Wake up on Monday morning and all over the papers is the fact that this mural has been power washed away by a very angry Bajan who feels that how this girl does come and disrespect the space. Why did she think that she could come and paint on our national monument and not have a discussion about it? And this was being discussed everywhere that I went. It was in the papers and it was on the radio and all this thing. What was interesting to me about the conversation that often what it would come down to is whether or not this was in fact a national monument. Nobody could agree. Some people were saying it's a national monument and it needs to be treated in a certain way, and some people were like, oh, it's definitely not a national monument. What are they talking about? And this became very representative of the experience in Barbados for me, because in Barbados, it was very much about documentation and history, right? And coming after the archive discussion. So, are my photos too small? I'm sorry. Because I see squinting. So these are some of the things that I saw. So it's not that there's no museum in Barbados. There is the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, which I went to, but I can't show you anything because you're not allowed to take any photos. It was a very stiff, very sort of stodgy space, right? Very much your, colonial inheritance style museum. And that was complicated even further by the fact that the Queen's Gallery, which was a very important space in Barbados, and a lot of exhibitions would happen there, had been closed for almost a decade. And that's a photo of it there. And every year, again, just like the National Gallery, it was about to be reopened. It was being refurbished, but nobody knew when it actually would be. So the Barbados art community had taken a significant hit. There was nowhere to exhibit work. And this was something that was being talked about a lot. Again, there's no National Gallery, so also archiving was strange, right? Or the histories were very hard to come by. So people were telling me, oh, there's 3 national collections, but there's no art gallery. And it took a long time to pick out what that actually meant. And it meant going and meeting with people, meeting with Alessandra Cummings, these kinds of people who had the histories in their heads. And I would say, but this is so interesting, why haven't you written about it? And they would say, it's true, I should write about it. So again, thinking about this documentation thing. But then you would go around and there'd be these things, which I found deeply disturbing. I mean, this is in a plaza, right? And this is, an artist who graduated from the Barbados Community College, an art school that I actually have a lot of respect for, very high quality students. But so this guy who went and studied art at the Barbados Community College with great teachers and all of this, did this monument, I guess, and it's in a mall in Barbados right by the entrance, right? And then I also went and saw this one by the animal caves, which is a kind of tourist site. And so, you know, you have your tourist line down here with what to me was like this mummy figure. Why is this all over Barbados? I don't get it. And I had seen this in Ewan Atkinson's work, but I didn't understand how significant it was in the landscape. It was so visible. And so for me, this was this screaming history that was really uncomfortable as a black woman and all these other black women walking around, but everybody was kind of cool with it, right? So certain things were being archived and memorialized, and some other things were not. I don't want to just make it seem like it was just, there was not some, you know what I mean? Because there were also these other ways that people were finding to do this archiving work. And so I went to visit 2 collections, the Mervyn Awan collection, both of them very impressive. And instead of telling you about Mervyn, I'm going to play this little bit of video of him talking about Philip Moore, a Guyanese artist. I work in his collection, to give you a sense of this kind of collector.
In Guyana, a lot of the salmon trees are right on the waters, on the
Can you hear?
what they call the canals.
Yeah.
And they get very, very heavy, and sometimes one would crash. And this tree fell. Anyway, he cut a series of slabs out of it, you know, because it's
hefty, I'm sure.
it's one worse.
Oh wait, you didn't have one hanging in the stairwell that was, oh no, that's not him.
That is
Yeah,
the-
that is
ball
him.
bearings one I'm talking about.
That's
You can understand what's being said, right?
Bearings and ball bearings and,
Is it title?
Yeah, because you pull the pails on ball bearings to bring the water.
Water
from
to
one
the
place.
thing, that's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Minibus symphony.
Yes, this is the minibus symphony, because you said all these, you know, these little, I suppose you would call them, what you would call taps in Haiti,
Yes,
you know, the minibuses,
yes.
you know, and you had all these, this is the minibus symphony. And so he was working on it, and I said, you know, Philip, it's coming along, isn't it? He said, yeah. I said, well, you know, before you finish it, I think I'll take it. So he said, all right. And then when it was finished, he had this little rasta in the middle who was conducting.
The whole symphony.
So I said, but Philip, you know, when I was last year, you were nearly finished, but you didn't have any of these. They're very fine copper wires, huh? What are these wires? He said, them is the vibes, man. That's what I said. He said, them is the vibes.
So, I was supposed to visit Mervyn for an hour and a half, and I was there for 3.5 hours. Lord have mercy. Okay, so went to go see the Mervyn Awan collection, got all these great stories. Mervyn opens his house to BCC students. He has tours coming through almost monthly of students coming to look at this amazing collection of work from across the Caribbean. So I had the National Gallery, right, in Jamaica. I can walk into the National Gallery of Jamaica and see the art historical canon of Jamaica. And I only began to understand why this was important. I was so busy challenging the canon that I never realized how important it was to have this institution that kept the canon so that I could challenge it, right? So they had instead, like the Mervyn Awan collection, and then Colleton House, which has a really interesting story, all of which I cannot go into now, but was this amazing collection of European art and also art from the Pacific. But the European art was artworks that featured black figures. So it was a whole collection, a massive collection of European art with black figures in them. And basically it was being sold off because the guy who owned the collection died, and the family didn't care to keep it together. Many attempts were made to get the Bajan government to buy the collection so that it could remain there, and they fell through change of government, this, that, they agree, and then the cabinet is reshuffled, and then the agreement is thrown out the window. And so it was being kind of broken down as when I saw it. This is a video of the collection, the Pacific collection, just to give you a sense of the significance of what is there and is now being lost. It's being sold off little by little. So again, thinking about archives and documentation in Barbados, and so I decided that my little initiative there would be this. So already it was brought up, RA was a magazine that was being done in Barbados in the early 90s, and that was kind of trying to connect the Caribbean region. Some of the ideas that are being worked over right now, you know, Fresh Milk has the map of Caribbean spaces, started out in this magazine, and it was in the first days talking with Natalie and Catherine and saying, oh, you know, I'm thinking about history and archiving, that one of them, or maybe both, was like, well, you should look at RA. And so it was there, and I was reading this stuff, and I'm like, but this is conversations we're having right now. This is why I was levitating off my chair when Eddie was giving his presentation, because I'm like, yes, we have to stop starting from zero. And so I decided to digitize these. So now they're online, and Fresh Milk has put them out on their website, and that was the initiative there. Other initiatives of interest, Punch, very, very interesting initiative. They've just brought their students to Venice. They fundraised it all themselves, and they've done trips like that year after year. Yes, Rosie, similar to the kind of work that you do. They also do talks and screenings. The Artists Alliance, this is Onika Small's group, and this came about very informally. Now, I'm not going to say that the exhibitions are always amazing. They do tend to be kind of a hodgepodge because they're done by open call. But this was the second of them that was going, the second of her series of exhibitions. And it just really came out of necessity, out of the fact that when Barbados was celebrating their 50th anniversary, there was no plan to do anything with the arts at all. And so Onika got somebody to give her an office building and did an open call and put up work from Bajan artists to show that things had been happening in the art scene in the last 50 years. And it just kind of snowballed when she realized people really wanted this. So we had a really interesting conversation about directions that this could take, and we're having a kind of ongoing discussion. Also, Sheena Rose's Projects and Space, which is another sort of residency that happens in Barbados. I spent 4 days with Sheena doing a kind of mini residency. And she's done some pretty significant work, I think. She's an artist herself, but she's had other artists come to visit, curators, and they come and stay with her. And I would recommend anybody going to Barbados to check her out, because Sheena has a very different perspective on Barbados that is very urban. And so after spending time at Fresh Milk and having this, you know, being out on a farm and getting this kind of image of the space, I got to really like go into Bridgetown with Sheena, you know. And so that was a nice balance. And this is just a work that was produced at Projects and Space that is one of my favorite. It's actually a GIF. So it was just to give you a sense of, you know, Sheena's done some cool things. Okay, Tembe in Suriname. Tembe is a really interesting initiative. It's in Mungo, in one of the Maroon communities in Suriname. It's in the rural area. I'm gonna have to run through really fast because time. But Tembe is what brought me to Suriname. But I decided to spend a couple of days in Paramaribo first before I went out to Mungo. So my first impressions of Suriname, I've never really seen anything at all like Suriname. I was completely, I put this 250-cent coin here because it was very representative of Suriname to me. This kind of like in-betweenness, versions of in-betweenness that I wouldn't even have imagined. Of course, it makes sense. Sometimes you need 250 cents, but I was just like, what? What is this? So these are some of the things that I saw to give you an idea of the kind of diversity. Traditional Maroon home at Sana Budaya, which is a center for preserving Javanese culture, and they have a monument to 100 years of migration to Suriname. Yeah, Javanese, right? Also, like amazing mosques and also Hindu temples everywhere, right next door to, you know, old Dutch-style architecture. It was just, and I was completely overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do with myself. So those are my first impressions. Then I head out to Mungo, which is a bauxite town, a town that was founded by bauxite, really. And when there was a civil war in Suriname in the 80s, and the Maroon towns, the Maroon population was badly affected by it, right? And so Mungo kind of degenerated really quickly as a result of that. And also because Soralco, the main bauxite company, left Mungo. So the main place that people would get employment from was gone. So Marcel has started up Tembe in 2009. And one of the most visible things about Tembe's work is the sculpture garden that he's developed, which is not a garden, it's all over the town. Right? Everywhere you go, there are these contributions from different residents that have come, and each one has to do a piece of public artwork. And so these are some of the examples of just work that's all around. This is not actually a public artwork, it's just a stage made from recycled cars, which is just wonderful. Tembe has a lot of different elements. One of them is the Contemporary Art Museum. These are some images from there. So yes, Suriname's first Contemporary Art Museum was founded in rural Mungo. There are 2 buildings, and it's actually a pretty impressive space with work from all across the Caribbean. They also have an annual arts festival. Every year it's something different. So this one was visual arts. They also did a theater and performance one, music, and every year they change to something else, but it brings huge numbers of people to Mungo. Because one of the interesting things about Marcel is that he's very much about helping people to figure out how to support themselves, right? So it's mobilizing creative activity in that specific way, which I think is interesting. And he has also a music studio, which I was going to show you a video of, but it's too loud. The most recent thing that they've done is the Kibiwikoni Research Center. Kibiwikoni means keep our culture. Yes, in a Maroon language. And so they've developed this research center, which Marcel very confidently told me was going to become a University of Maroon Knowledge. And he's the kind of guy that, I believe it, it's going to become a University of Maroon Knowledge, because that's just how Marcel works. And what the Kibiwikoni Research Center has been doing is collecting all this knowledge about Maroon culture in this space. So they have a room, a screening room with some computers, and they've now been training people from the community to do research. So right now, the reason why Marcel is not here is because he's doing a major research symposium where he's invited all of his various collaborators from across the world working on this to a seminar in Mungo, where they're training new researchers to generate more knowledge around this. Okay, so what did I do in Suriname? Well, I did a lot of interviews. And why? This was not arbitrary, right? Because what was needed at the time with the seminar coming up, and also with the festival coming up, what was really needed was visibility. And that's what people were asking of me as well. When I would go in and have conversations, people would also be shocked. What am I doing in Suriname looking at art? Right? A curator is coming here to look at our stuff? Oh, okay, that's strange. But also very excited about the fact that I would be writing about Suriname. So they were like, oh, you're going to write about Suriname? Where is it going to be published? When is it going to come out? What are you going to say? And so I realized that this matter of visibility and also a kind of bringing to language of this activity was an important thing there. And so I did the first interview, and Marcel liked what I said, so he set me up with 3 more. And so I did a lot of talking about the various cultural institutions that I visited, including Tembe, to a Surinamese audience, and then was told by many people very specific things that I needed to communicate to a broader audience. My bank actually closed off my credit card because I told them I was going to Trinidad and Suriname, and they thought Suriname was in Trinidad. Oh yeah, a regional bank, right? So this is a serious issue. And so I've taken that quite seriously, and that was a lot of what I did there. Finally, Beta Local. And to tell you about Beta Local, I'm just going to tell you what they say about themselves. And I think that the language itself will tell you why Beta Local is interesting to me. I'll be going there next month. Beta Local is an organization, a working group, and a physical space in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Better Local is a study and production program, an experimental education project, and a platform for critical discussion and production immersed in our local reality. San Juan, the tropics, the Caribbean, the unplanned city. So again, responding to specific spaces, right? And our present moment, the economic crisis, the infinite potential, the skills and ideas of people who live here now. There are some local variables, such as the stagnation of local cultural institutions, the lack of an MFA program in the arts, a debilitating brain drain, and the prohibitive costs of higher education outside of Puerto Rico, as well as the peddling of the generic as international by many art schools and cultural institutions. Amen. We view these as opportunities for generating new forms. Better Local does not aspire to become another node in the globalized art market or academic spectrum. We are not interested in a mimetic practice. Right? And they're serious about this. There's a lot of integrity to the way that Better Local works and congruence with this description. This is an idea of some of their programming, some of the ones that I'm most interested in, I'll talk about now. Like Ivan Illich, I really like. You see an image of people making cassava there. And so it's a program where they invite, well, anyone can propose a course or a seminar and teach it. And so it's in all kinds of things, basket weaving, like I said, making cassava. I did a talk about writing, and it just really opens up what kinds of knowledges we consider valuable and legitimizes these different kinds of exchanges, right? And they're all free. Also, the walking tours, they also have a editorial and publishing house that's attached to them, so they do a lot of like art books. And also the Mouth project, which I don't know if it will be going a lot longer, but what they're interested in doing is kind of cataloging the like woods and plants and trees, archiving all of that and the uses that they've had in Puerto Rico. There is a serious archival problem in Puerto Rico because of the special relationship with the US, and so they're trying to address that by first looking at the land itself. And so that's an idea of some of the projects. And that's it, thank you.
We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but I think that was a really inspiring talk. It always is when Nicole speaks. She was here at the MAC conference we did in October, and I think had a standing ovation as well. So thank you so much. And the fellowship is, would you like to come up and talk for 2 seconds? It is evolving. It is going to be available again soon, hopefully, and we'll post that. Come and talk about it. And then we are literally going to hit the buses because we have a tight turnaround. Nicole, thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly, this obviously has had a phenomenal impact on Nicole's practice, and it has been a really wonderful thing for Tilting Axis to be able to do this. We very much want to move the fellowship forward, and we're just putting out a call to anyone who's connected to an organization or institution that wants to participate and contribute to that, either in kind or be an economic partner in the fellowship. It was initially supported by the British Council in partnership with the Caribbean Spaces that Nicole visited, and CCA in Glasgow, Mother Tongue, David Dale Gallery and Studios in Hospital Field. So we want to move it forward, and we're just putting this out so that we can find ways in which we can keep doing this. And I think that there are not a lot of opportunities for professional development for Caribbean curators within the Caribbean. So I'm just leaving that with you. Thank you. I think having, we're looking at between 10 or 15,000 US dollars. Yes. Well, we would like to do it on an annual basis, where we do an open call, it goes out, people apply, and yeah. So, but that was amazing, Nicole. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Okay, so we have buses hopefully waiting outside to take you back to the hotel. I think we will try and push everything back by 15 minutes just because we are a bit exhausted. So if you can be just outside reception, if you're coming to Chris Cozier's lecture this evening, be outside at about 5:45 at the hotel. And if you're not coming to the lecture and you're just coming to dinner, be outside of the hotel at 6:45 and you'll go straight to the restaurant. Otherwise, you'll go to the restaurant from here. And if that's not clear, just ask one of us. Thanks.
And feel free to add exhibitions to the timeline. And also, for us.
A way for me to take my PowerPoint off of this to put it on that so that Alan